The day my son told me I no longer had a home, he was peeling potatoes in my tiny, sunlit kitchen when I heard the front door open, the hinges creaking in that familiar way they always did when someone pushed too hard. It was the kind of ordinary morning that wraps itself around you like a warm blanket. The kind that makes you feel safe in a world that often forgets to be gentle. The kettle was humming on the stove, releasing thin streams of steam that curled up like soft ribbons. Outside, the birds were singing their little winter songs, hopping around the bare branches as if the cold couldn't bother them. My old radio murmured the news in that comforting, static voice it had used for decades, filling the quiet corners of my home with a steady hum. I didn't expect anything unusual to happen that morning. I didn't expect anyone to walk through the door with news that would shift the ground beneath my feet. I didn't expect my life, the one I had carefully built through years of sacrifice, to tilt in a direction I wasn't prepared for. But then Daniel walked in. He didn't knock. He didn't call out, "Mum," the way he used to when he was younger. He didn't even wipe his shoes on the mat, the way he always insisted he did as a boy. His shoes were still wet with rain, leaving dark, muddy prints on the floor I had cleaned only the night before. And in his hands, held stiffly like a verdict he had rehearsed delivering, were papers. Not just any papers. Thick, official papers with clipped edges, and a coldness that reached me before he even opened his mouth. The sight of them made me pause, the potatoes slipping slightly in my hand. My instincts whispered that whatever was written on those pages carried a weight that didn't care about the 40 years I had spent raising him alone. That paper didn't know my sleepless nights, my sacrifices, my aching hands, or my years spent trying to be both mother and father to him. Paper has no memory, but I did, and in that moment, my memories felt painfully alive. Daniel didn't sit. He didn't smile. He didn't greet me with the warmth I used to see in his eyes. He stood there, rigid and closed off, like a stranger who had wandered into my home wearing my son's face. His expression was unreadable, guarded, almost businesslike. He looked at me with a seriousness that made the room feel suddenly colder. "Mom," he said, and his voice was too steady, too controlled, too rehearsed to be kind. "We're selling this house. You need to move to a senior facility. We already signed the deal." Just like that. No build-up, no discussion, no space for my heart to prepare itself for impact. The potato slipped from my fingers and dropped to the floor, rolling across the tiles until it gently bumped against the cabinet. The knife stayed in my hand, but it no longer felt like mine. My fingers tingled as if they were waking up from a dream they didn't want to leave. My knees wobbled, and for a moment I felt like a child against malt, scared, unsteady, trying to make sense of something too big to understand. Everything inside me froze, except for my heartbeat, which pounded so hard it felt like it was trying to escape my chest. I gripped the edge of the counter, grounding myself because the room felt like it was tilting and I was afraid I might fall. I looked at him, searching desperately for something familiar, a hint of softness, a flicker of doubt, a trace of the little boy who used to run to me when he scraped his knee, crying out, "Mommy, help me." The boy whose nightmares I soothed by sitting beside his bed until he fell asleep again. The boy who used to slip little notes under my bedroom door that said, "Love you, Mom," written in those crooked letters children learn just before they realize how powerful those 3 words can be. I searched for that child, clinging to hope, waiting for him to shake his head and say, "I'm kidding," or "I didn't mean it," or even "I'm sorry." But none of that came. His eyes were cold, confident, already decided. "I don't need a senior facility," I whispered, my voice trembling, barely able to thread itself together. "It's for the best," he replied, with a tone so dismissive it felt like a slap. "We'll handle the move," I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Me and Claire," he said. "My daughter Inla, the woman who still called me Mrs. Walker after 7 years, who never once called me Mom, the woman whose perfume always filled the air before she even stepped into a room, whose voice carried the tone of someone who believed she deserved more than she had, the woman who always looked at my house like it was an outdated museum exhibit that needed to be cleaned, emptied, or modernized. I always felt like a guest in my own home when she visited. Daniel walked to the kitchen table, the same table where I once placed his birthday cakes year after year. He laid the papers down exactly where his 7th birthday cake had sat, the one he pretended to hate because it didn't have enough frosting, but he secretly loved because I made it just for him. 40 years of memories, gone with a signature, stood there, gripping the counter, feeling the weight of everything I had carried alone. The sacrifices, the tears, the hopes, the dreams, and as my son, my own flesh and blood, told me I no longer had a place in the home I kept alive, he didn't know one thing. One truth I had buried deep inside my heart for most of my life, a truth that would unravel everything he thought he knew. The house he believed he was selling was never mine to begin with, and the real owner, the one person I prayed would never return, was walking back into my life, carrying secrets I ran from, memories I tried to bury, and a truth that would shatter everything Daniel thought he understood about me and about himself.
Before that morning, when Daniel walked in with papers that sliced through my life, our story had looked like something steady and ordinary, the kind of quiet life that people imagine when they think of small comforts. A modest yard with a wobbly fence, a mailbox that always had a little stack of bills, and sometimes a handwritten postcard, curtains that never matched because I refused to toss out things that still had memories sewn into them. The house he wanted to sell wasn't simply 4 walls and a roof. It was a weathered map of every small miracle and every quiet hurt I had lived through. It was where Daniel took his first uncertain steps, where he learned to hum the tune his father used to whistle, where his laughter ricocheted off the kitchen tiles and made even the dullest chores feel like celebrations. It was where I learned how to survive a world that didn't hand out second chances with politeness, where I learned to fold worry into a smile and keep my hands moving so the nights wouldn't swallow me. I remember that house in the way you remember a person you loved who wasn't perfect. Every dent in the banister had a story, every long scratched tabletop held the echo of an argument settled with coffee and a forgiving sigh, and the back bedroom still smelled faintly of the baby powder I used when Daniel was small. I had built a life inside those rooms brick by brick, not because I had legal papers or certainty, but because I had stubbornness and stubborn love. At the time, I thought the small untruths I kept, little omissions and quiet arrangements, could be softened by how much love wrapped around them, that silent sacrifices were noble if they let my child grow up safe and unafraid. I never imagined that the same hands I kissed when his fever burned would one day sign away the roof above my head without blinking. I never imagined that the house I had kept alive in unpaid bills and careful repairs would become a bargaining chip in a life I still thought I shared. Daniel grew up without a father's steady hand in the evenings, without someone to teach him how to fix a leaky tap or how to fold a suit so it didn't wrinkle. I tried to make sure he never felt the emptiness I felt at his age. I worked double shifts at the factory when he was small, then at the diner later when nights were quieter and the tips were better. I came home with my feet aching, my back heavy from the day, but I always found the energy to make warm dinners and to sit on the edge of his bed and listen to his small worries about school or what boys at recess had said. I sewed his Halloween costumes by hand when money was tight, stayed awake to help with homework I barely remembered, and taught him to say please and thank you, to hold doors open, to help others because there might come a time when someone did the same for him. Those lessons felt like seeds planted in good soil. For many years I believed they took root. He was a kind boy, soft-hearted, stubborn in a good way, always tucking little notes into my coat pockets that said love you, Mom, in those rushed, sincere letters of a child who thought his mother saved the world. I kept every one of those notes in a little wooden box under my bed, a treasure chest of crooked letters and small drawings that smelled faintly of crayons. How could I have known that those same hands, so gentle when he was small, would one day become quick with decisions that left me on the outside? How could I have known that the fierce, tender boy would carry away the tenderness and replace it with a pragmatic voice I barely recognized? Life did not shift all at once. It changed in small, almost invisible ways when Daniel met Claire. She wasn't cruel on the surface. She smiled. She used the right words. She wore gloves to family dinners like a person who knew how to keep distance even while being polite. But her warmth had edges. She came from a world where feelings were measured and revealed sparingly, where kindness was a currency doled out when convenient and sentiment was boxed and labeled as impractical. In her eyes, my home was quaint in the wrong way, outdated, cluttered, sentimental in a way that suggested weakness. She didn't like old things, she didn't like clutter, she didn't like the little habits that had become the bones of our lives. My mismatched china, the stack of library books, the faded quilts I refused to throw away. To her, those were not memories to be cherished, but obstacles to the life she imagined. Daniel changed around her, not like someone who betrays overnight, but like a river that shifts direction over seasons, quietly eroding the banks of what we used to call ours. He started to hurry through conversations with me, to answer with one-word replies, to check his phone when I told a story. He became sharper in tone and more impatient in a way that surprised me. The softness that used to be his shield had been put away, folded as if it were no longer useful. Even then, I loved them both. I folded myself smaller so they could unfold their future. I said yes when I wanted to say no. I swallowed my pride so they could save face in the world that prized the new and the now. I stayed quiet even when my heart begged me to speak, because mothers keep their pain to protect their children from the burden of worry. I thought I was doing right, shielding them, smoothing the path so that their steps might be steadier than mine had been. But pain does not disappear because it is silent. Pain gathers in the corners like dust, unnoticed until a draft reveals it, until you see it spread across the furniture. It builds pressure inside the bones, a storm that hums under the skin, waiting. I felt that storm in the small things Claire suggested. Another tile, a new couch, an easier-to-clean countertop. Each small change chipped away at the house I had made a home. I felt it in Daniel's eyes when he didn't look at me straight on, in the way he sometimes excused himself from family dinners, in the whispers I caught when doors were closed and secrets were quickened. The storm was a slow, cruel thing, and I mistakenly believed time could smooth it all. I thought patience was a salve that would heal the fraying threads between us. I thought if I kept being kind, the love that raised him would remind him of who I was. Years passed under that quiet erosion until the foundation of our relationship, trust, gratitude, the small, everyday rituals that stitch people together, was thinned almost beyond recognition. Still, I believed in the idea that life could be fixed with patience and conversation at the right time. I believed in the old promise that if you give enough, something good will come back. But I was wrong. The storm did not pass. It arrived fully one ordinary morning when Daniel placed those cold papers on my kitchen table. Looking back, I can see that the seeds of that moment sprouted long before I understood. They were planted in the silences I kept about small humiliations, about the nights I cried into my pillow when money ran out, and about the one truth I carried like a secret scar. The name of the person who had owned the house before me, a name I prayed would never resurface, and a past I hoped would stay buried. I had kept that secret because I wanted Daniel to grow up strong and proud, because I thought the knowledge would only complicate his life, because I was ashamed to admit I had accepted help the way a drowning person accepts a rope. But life, as it often does, has a way of returning what we try to hide. Truth does not stay down forever. It walks back in slowly, step by step, mile by mile, and in my case it arrived with the soft but certain weight of a man who knew how to knock on a door and claim what was his. Whether I was ready for the consequences or not, the truth was on its way back to me, and with it came choices I had not prepared to make and reckonings I had long postponed. 2 days after the letter arrived, just as the winter sun was beginning to sink behind the roofs of the neighborhood, I heard a knock on the front door, slow, deliberate, a knock that sounded nothing like Daniel's hurried tapping or Claire's sharp, impatient rhythm. This knock carried time in it. It carried distance. It carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had finally decided to stop running. I felt the sound ripple through the hallway, vibrating through the wooden floorboards like the heartbeat of a story that had been waiting far too long to be told. When I opened the door, I froze in place. There he was. Isaac. Older, yes. Time had carved itself into the lines on his face, etched soft silver into his hair, dimmed the brightness of the boyish charm he once carried so effortlessly. But his eyes were the same. Still deep, still intense, still carrying more truth than words could ever hold. I hadn't seen him in decades, but in that moment it felt like no time had passed at all, and yet an entire lifetime had stretched between us. For a long moment, we simply stared at each other, suspended in a silence thick enough to drown in. Memories flickered through my mind like old film reels, his laughter in the kitchen, the way his hands trembled the night we said goodbye, the promises he made, the choices that tore us apart. And beneath all that history, all that unsaid truth, stood the simple reality that this man, the one I once loved, still held the deed to the roof over my head. He stepped past me gently, as though asking the house for permission to enter. His gaze traveled slowly through the hallway, across the pictures on the walls, down to the floorboards he had installed with his father when he was just a teenager. This wasn't just my home. This was his history, his legacy, his heartwood buried beneath the layers of my life. I didn't bother making small talk. There was no point pretending we were strangers meeting for casual conversation. So I led him into the living room, and we sat across from each other like two people preparing to rewrite the past. And then I told him everything. I told him about Daniel showing up with the papers. I told him about being pushed into a senior home like someone past their expiration date. I told him how Claire barely acknowledged me. I told him how my son, the child I raised, the child he never met, was ready to sell the house I had built my life inside, all while never knowing the truth about who actually owned these walls. Isaac listened without interrupting. His hands were folded, his jaw tight, his eyes never once leaving mine. And in his quietness, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, being understood, truly understood. When I finished, I expected anger, maybe disappointment, maybe pity. But Isaac only exhaled slowly, as if releasing decades of unsaid words. Then he leaned forward, placed one hand flat on the coffee table between us, and spoke with a voice that cut straight through the fog that had been choking me for months. "You cannot sell a house that isn't yours." The room froze around me. My heartbeat thudded in my ears, loud and relentless. I had lived with this truth for so long that I had almost forgotten the power it carried. Hearing it spoken out loud, hearing it acknowledged after years of silence, felt like being cracked open from the inside. Not with pain, but with the force of reality finally demanding to be faced. Isaac explained everything calmly. He told me he had never legally transferred the property into my name. He had wanted to, once. He had almost done it on a warm spring morning decades ago, but our lives had split before he made it official. Yet even after our breakup, even after he left to build a future elsewhere, he had quietly paid the property taxes every year. He had kept the house in his name. He had watched over Daniel and me from afar, not intruding, never interfering, but always making sure we had stability, safety, a place to grow. He confessed he thought he was doing the right thing back then, giving me a home while also giving himself distance. And I confessed that I had never told Daniel the truth because I didn't want him to feel like our life depended on someone who had left us. I wanted him to feel secure, grounded, protected. I never imagined that hiding the truth would one day tear everything apart. Isaac stood up then, walked over to the kitchen doorway, and touched the wooden frame where Daniel's height marks were still carved. His hand trembled as he traced the tallest mark, Daniel at 17. I didn't realize tears had slipped down my face until Isaac turned to me and his expression softened into something that shattered the last piece of my defenses. "You've carried this alone for too long," he said softly. "Let me help now." Those words, gentle, unexpected, were the final push that tilted everything. Because before I could respond, the front door opened. I didn't hear footsteps, didn't hear a greeting, just the unmistakable click of the latch and the heavy thud of the door swinging inward. Daniel walked in. His eyes landed on Isaac. Then on me. Then on the letter on the table. Confusion flickered, then suspicion, then something darker, sharper, rising like a tide about to break. Isaac stepped forward calmly, shoulders squared, voice steady. "Daniel," he said, "we need to talk about this house, about your mother, about the truth you were never told." The air tightened. Daniel's jaw clenched. I felt my knees weaken as the collision of past and present slammed together in my living room like a storm finally crashing ashore. This was the moment everything would change. The moment that would either tear us apart forever or force every buried truth to surface, no matter how painful. And as the three of us stood there, me shaking, Daniel fuming, Isaac unmovable, I realized that the past wasn't done with us. It had walked right through my door. And it was ready to rewrite everything. The moment Daniel stepped through the doorway and saw Isaac standing beside me, The air inside the house shifted so sharply that even the old wooden floor seemed to react. His eyes widened, not with recognition, because he had never seen Isaac before, but with the instinctive dread of someone walking into a room where the truth has already arrived ahead of them. His posture stiffened, shoulders drawn up, jaw tightening the way it used to when he was a boy trying to hide that he'd broken something he shouldn't have touched. Except this time, the thing breaking wasn't a toy or a window. It was the fragile illusion that our lives had been built on solid ground. He stepped forward slowly, each footfall echoing with a tension that seemed to vibrate inside my bones. His eyes flicked from Isaac's calm, steady presence to my trembling hands, then to the letter on the table, and finally back to me. He looked like someone watching the walls close in, unsure which corner held the truth and which held the trap. I could almost hear the storm building behind his silence, that familiar mix of irritation, confusion, and something deeper than anger, deeper than pride, something closer to fear or betrayal. Or maybe both at once. "Mom, what's going on?" he asked, but his voice cracked on the last word, the way it used to when he was small and afraid of losing something. Isaac didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. His presence alone stabilized the moment just enough for me to finally do what I had feared for decades. I drew in a long, steady breath. Then I began to tell my son everything. I told him about the years before he was born, about the love Isaac and I once shared, the plans we made before life pulled us apart, and the way fate carved different paths for us, paths that hurt more than either of us admitted. I told him how Isaac had stepped in to help me when I had nowhere to go, how he gave me this house, not as a gift of charity, but as a promise, a shelter, a lifeline when the world offered none. I told him the truth he never knew, that the house he grew up in was a sanctuary built from a past he was never told existed, a past I hid to keep him safe from shame, judgment, and the complicated pain of adult mistakes. Daniel sank into the chair as the truth washed over him. His eyes darted between us, searching for lies, explanations, ways to rearrange the pieces of his reality into a shape he could recognize. He pressed his elbows onto his knees and tangled his fingers into his hair, trying to hold himself together while decades of silence cracked open around him. The quietness became a weight, thick, suffocating, stretching across the room until the ticking of the old wall clock was the only sound filling the space between us. When he finally spoke, his voice was a broken echo of the boy he used to be. "Why didn't you tell me?" There it was, the question that carried the weight of everything, resentment, loss, confusion, the sting of feeling left out of his own history. I could feel the question burrowing into my chest, scraping through every memory I had tried to protect him from. I told him the truth, not as an excuse, but as a confession. I told him I wanted him to grow up believing I had strength, not secrets. I wanted him to feel safe, not abandoned. I wanted him to believe his mother had built a life for him through her own hands, not through the lingering generosity of a man she loved and lost. I admitted that I hid the truth because I was ashamed, not of Isaac, but of my own fear, my own brokenness, my own inability to give Daniel the world without accepting help. As I spoke, my tears finally broke free, sliding down my cheeks like the truth itself was melting through the armor I had worn for so long. Daniel's face softened, not fully, not instantly, but enough for a small crack of understanding to appear in his expression. He didn't rush to comfort me. He didn't reach for me, but he didn't turn away either. And sometimes, staying in the room during the truth is the first step toward forgiveness. Isaac stepped forward then, gently placing the deed on the table between us. His movements were steady, patient, deliberate, like a man finally finishing a task he should have completed decades ago. He explained everything to Daniel. The taxes he'd paid, the legal documents he'd kept, the decision he made to return now because he had learned what was happening and could no longer stay silent. The realization that the house he once shared with me had become the center of a wound that needed to be healed, not hidden. Daniel listened with a mix of disbelief and remorse. When he finally spoke, the anger that had once fueled him had dimmed into something more raw regret. His voice broke as he apologized, not just for the papers, not just for the decision to push me into a senior facility, but for the distance he had created between us over the years without even realizing it. His apology wasn't perfect. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't wrapped in a bow of sudden understanding, but it was real. And real, even when small, is powerful. Stopping the house sale took time, but Isaac handled it with the calm confidence of someone who had waited long enough to reclaim what mattered. And when everything was finally resolved, when the legal pieces fell into place, and the threat of eviction faded like a bad dream, I found myself staring at Isaac as he slid the freshly signed deed toward me. "Now it's yours," he said. "Truly yours, no secrets, no shadows." My hands shook as I held the papers, not because I cared about the house itself, but because this moment symbolized something deeper: truth, closure, dignity, and the quiet strength of a woman who had spent her life surviving for the sake of someone else. Daniel asked if he could help repair what had fractured between us. I didn't say yes. The wound was deep, and trust cannot be rebuilt in an afternoon. But I didn't say no either. We chose to begin again, with small conversations, gentle boundaries, slow steps toward a relationship built not on silence but on honesty. The house that had nearly become the weapon of betrayal slowly transformed back into what it once was: a place of healing, of history, of hope. It didn't magically fix everything. Walls don't erase pain. Roofs don't mend trust. But the house remained standing, and so did we, not as perfect people, not as a flawless family, but as human beings trying to understand one another again. And sometimes that kind of beginning is enough to rewrite a lifetime. Morning Daniel walked out, leaving those papers behind like a knife still dripping on the table. Something inside me cracked in a place I didn't even know existed. A deep, ancient fault line that had been waiting silently for the right pressure to split me open. I stayed standing in that kitchen long after the door slammed hard enough to rattle the frame, long after his footsteps dissolved into the rain-soaked street, long after the sound of his engine faded like a final goodbye disguised as ordinary noise. My hand remained curled around the back of the wooden chair, fingers stiff and aching. Holding on like the worn spindle beneath my palm was the last solid thread tethering me to a world that suddenly, terrifyingly, no longer made sense. The kettle on the stove had gone quiet, its once cheerful hum reduced to a ghost of steam. The radio paused mid-song, as if even it didn't dare intrude on the ruin settling around me. Outside the window, the birds which usually chattered at dawn sat silent on the drooping telephone wires, their heads tucked in, their wings unmoving, as though the entire world had paused with me and was watching, quietly, almost respectfully, as I unraveled one thin strand at a time. When my legs finally obeyed me, they did not carry me with purpose. They drifted through the house on their own, like I had become a passenger inside my own body. I wasn't walking through a living home anymore. I was walking through a museum of a life I had built, guarded, and poured my soul into for decades. Every step felt heavier than the last, as though grief had fingers and was gripping my ankles, dragging me backward into memories I wasn't ready to face. My fingertips brushed against the faded wallpaper Daniel, and I glued up together when he was 8 years old. Just the two of us, covered in paste, sticky, messy, laughing until we hiccuped. I remembered how he insisted on choosing the pattern with little sailboats, even though we lived nowhere near the ocean, and how he hugged me afterward, proud of a day well spent. I slid my hand along the wooden railing of the stairs, the same railing Daniel used to slide down every morning before school, even though I scolded him endlessly about breaking his arm one day. And on the living room doorway, faint but stubborn, were the pencil marks where I measured his height every birthday. Those marks felt like the fingerprints of time itself, proof that once upon a time, there lived a little boy who needed his mother desperately, who looked at me like I was the whole world. But now he didn't need me at all. Or worse, he had decided I was a burden to remove, a weight to be lifted, a problem to be solved. I tried in those early days to tell myself it was Claire whispering poison into his ear, tightening her grip around him the way ivy suffocates a strong old tree. But deep down, I knew the truth was not that simple, nor that convenient. Daniel had been changing long before this morning. His kindness had thinned into impatience, his warmth cooled into sharp edges, his voice grew clipped, tense, irritated by my presence. I excused every shift, told myself it was stress, adulthood, marriage, work, anything other than the possibility that my son had grown into someone capable of turning his back on me. Anything to avoid admitting that love does not always mature into gratitude. Sometimes it curdles into entitlement or blind loyalty to the wrong person. Days trickled by, slow and suffocating, each one blending into the next like a long gray smear on the calendar. I waited for Daniel to return, to call, to apologize, to soften, anything that sounded like the boy I once tucked into bed. But nothing came. Silence grew like mold in the corners of the house, darkening everything it touched. The papers he left behind sat on my kitchen table like a quiet threat, stiff and smug, their edges catching morning sunlight like sharpened blades. I didn't touch them. I couldn't. It felt like placing even one finger on those papers would make the betrayal official, would force me to acknowledge I had been written out of my own life. Neighbors began to whisper, not loudly, but just loudly enough. I felt their curious eyes following me when I stepped outside. They murmured about the house, the sale, the speed of it all. One afternoon, a real estate agent appeared at my door with a rehearsed smile that didn't reach her eyes. She asked gently, too gently, if I had any emotional attachments I needed help letting go of. The sheer nerve of it struck me like cold water in the face, as if memories were old shoes, as if pain was clutter. As if decades of love and sacrifice were nothing, but dust to sweep away in the name of efficiency. After that, the house began to feel different. Not in the dramatic, haunted way people like to tell stories about, but in the subtle way that creeps into the bones of a place that has held too many secrets for too long. The silence deepened, thickened. The walls felt closer somehow, heavier with all the unsaid words they'd held over the years. Even the air felt tight, as though the house itself were bracing for something inevitable. At night, when wind brushed against the glass, it almost sounded like murmurs, soft, insistent, like the house was reminding me that buried truths eventually claw their way back into the light. Because I did have a secret, a large one, a truth I had wrapped in silence so tightly that even I sometimes forgot it was there. A truth Daniel had never known, a truth I intended to take to my grave. The truth about the house, the truth about the man behind it, the truth about the love I once believed in and the heartbreak that followed. The truth about Isaac, the man whose name still sat quietly, stubbornly, on the deed tucked away in my lockbox. The man I had not spoken of or spoken to in decades, the man I had prayed the past had swallowed whole. Then, late one night, when the loneliness pressed against my ribs so hard I struggled to breathe, I heard something slip under the front door. Just a soft whisper of paper against wood, barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on my tired mind. But when I stepped into the hallway, I saw it, a plain white envelope lying on the floor, its edges catching a sliver of moonlight. My heart jolted in my chest, stuttering like it forgot how to beat. I bent down slowly, my hands trembling even before I touched it. The moment my fingers brushed the envelope, the world tilted. The handwriting on the front wasn't just familiar, it was unforgettable. Elegant loops, steady strokes, each letter crafted with the same slow, deliberate care that once made me believe promises meant forever. Isaac. His name wasn't written on the envelope, but it didn't need to be. I would know that handwriting anywhere, even in the dark, even after all these years. And as I held that envelope, feeling the weight of a past I had sealed shut, the truth I had tried so hard to bury pressed against my chest with the force of a memory too powerful to stay hidden. The walls of this house had been whispering for years. And now Isaac had returned, not with noise, but with a quiet that felt like a storm gathering. His arrival would shatter every lie I told, every secret I protected, every illusion Daniel believed about the life he thought was his. And in that moment, with the envelope trembling in my hand, I understood something with painful clarity. The past was no longer content to stay behind me. It was standing at my door. And it wanted to be heard.